Yeah, thank you very much for this welcome. Tonight we will talk about a topic that interests people. Bisschen laut, können wir es runterstellen? Schall, halt ein bisschen. That interests philosophers and scientists for more than 2,000 years, whether or not people, humans, have a free will, and what this means. Interestingly, interestingly, okay, when I was a student of philosophy, this debate was of no interest because first, most of my teachers in philosophy were convinced that we had a free will, and those who had some knowledge in natural sciences had learned that this problem cannot be decided. Because, as I said, if you can prove whether our decisions are predetermined or not, you should repeat a decision-making situation twice, which is impossible. And so the problem was dead. And everybody, when we asked, even 15 years ago in the Berlin Brandenburg Academy, we should talk about free will, where engineers who wanted this, a well-known philosopher was smiling and said, oh, this is not a good problem. Anyway, but 30 years ago, when this problem was almost dead, there was a colleague of mine, Benjamin Libet, who carried out an ingenious experiment, which then started a debate which still today is very vivid. And I will, of course, comment on this experiment. Let's start with two major philosophical positions. The first is free will and mental causation, which is closely related. It says the human mind or will can act independent of the causality of nature and thus transcend nature. This is a dualistic position, which means that there are things we can do and which are not determined by what goes on in nature. We can, as human beings, as supernatural beings, can transcend nature. And therefore, freedom of will is no illusion. The opposite position is pan-determinism, as I call it. All events of the world are causally determined. Accordingly, at least in principle, from the beginning of the universe on, all my decisions and actions are determined at any given moment and can, at least in principle, be predicted. And therefore, freedom of will is an illusion. So the idea that when the universe started, it was already clear what we will do tonight. And these are the two positions, and you can see that it's difficult to treat with these extreme situations, with extreme definitions. The strong concept of free will, in a modern sense, goes back to Immanuel Kant. And Kant is not only a famous philosopher, but his concept of free will was absolutely necessary for the modern concept of free will in criminal law. Today, all decisions on the court in criminal law are based on the existence of free will. And the Supreme Court in Germany in 1952 stated, because in criminal law it's not written whether or not free will exists, but the Supreme Court said free will exists. And this means, the authors wrote, people can decide against their own motives, which drive them towards something. So the capability to transcend, as Kant said, our own natural limitations. I will come to this back later. So free will is something non-material, and we have a material side of our existence and a non-material side of our existence. And it's interesting why Kant developed this position. He thought if there was no non-material free will, morality would not be possible. Because when we want to be good, we have to do it out of only one motive, which is to be good, not to do somebody a favor, or to do God a favor, or to go to paradise. Morality is based on moral action, which is circular. And Kant emphasizes this. Morality is because I have to be, according to my inner law, moral, and not because God has said it. He's atheistic in this sense. So free will must exist, otherwise morality doesn't exist, because everything else is egoistic. Even if I'm a good person and do this in order to please God, I'm egoistic, because then I come to heaven, to the paradise. This is no good reason for Kant. So he is very strict. And this means the notion intelligibility. Human beings act morally according to moral reasons, not to causes. Everything inside our nature, as Kant knows, as a good psychologist, is determined by natural motives, by natural acts, but not the will to be good, morality. Alternativism, then, this is the most important principle, is that under identical physical and psychological conditions, I can act otherwise. For example, my boss made me extremely angry, and I want to kill him. And he made me angry for 20 years. Now I said, no, I have to stop it. I have a revolver, and I go to him, and everything drives me to I'm a mean character, of course, and I have a bad youth and childhood, and everything, my whole entire existence drives me toward killing my boss, because he made me extremely angry. But despite this situation, I have the inborn possibility to act otherwise, to say, regardless of my motives, of genes, of childhood, of any circumstances, I can be moral. I have the pure decision doing otherwise. For example, not to kill my boss. And this is very important, because this is decisive in court, in criminal law. And if you can show that a criminal subject is mentally sane, and he knows what he did, and can regulate his own life, he is believed to be able to say no, regardless of his childhood, regardless of his genes. So this is alternativism. And this plays an absolutely crucial role in criminal law, even today. Alternativism means under identical material, physical, physiological conditions, I could act otherwise if I only wanted. So this means that there is something immaterial that enables me to decide otherwise. If everything in myself was natural, then this alternativism would be impossible. And from this follows responsibility. I'm morally, legally responsible for my actions, because I could act otherwise, and I'm guilty on the court. The judge tells me you're guilty because you had the possibility to act otherwise, but you killed your boss. You were not absolutely necessarily determined to kill him because you could otherwise. This is a fiction. Kant said, interestingly, I have to make this very clear, that this is a fiction, because he was a good psychologist and said, in natural life, in ordinary life, you will never find evidence for this, but it need to be. Otherwise, there is no morality. So this is a principle, a metaphysical principle. However, There are problems with the concept of free will and mental causation. Pure mental decisions, this is those not tied to neurophysiological processes, should be easily detectable in the brain if they had an impact on our actions. This is important because often philosophers say, well, there can be no empirical evidence for or against free will, because how could you show something non-natural? But this is wrong, because if I, as I will show you, can follow how inside the brain the wish or drive of something is created subconsciously, then becomes consciously, and then finally my arm moves to kill my boss or something, then, and this is macroscopically, as I will show, there should be a gap. There should be in the entire sequence of brain actions some fundamental gap. And what I'm then doing with my hand, if I do nothing, then I'm not guilty, so I should do something. Move the revolver or take the knife and kill him, there should be a decisive gap inside my brain. So whatever free will is, we as brain scientists should see the gap. If there's no gap, then we are in deep trouble as dualists. And however, there is no evidence for such a phenomenon, as I will show. In opposite, we believe, psychologists and neurobiologists believe that all human behavior is determined either by conscious or unconscious motives or by chance. Come to this back in a moment. Psychologically, will is a kind of energizing certain motives against counteracting motives. So most things which I'm doing during the day, I do without an explicit will, 95% or 99%. I have no will necessary to put one foot in front of the other. And most things, 99.9%, I would say, of my movements are not willed, because they are automatic. Although, when you ask me, who is doing this, it's me. So there is the attribution of actions even without will. This is a very important thing. But there, of course, there are motives. They may be conscious or unconscious. And if I need a will, then as psychologists say, there's some motive that is opposed to one major motive. And this, so will is formed only in a situation where there is a battle, a fight of motives. Then you need will as a special state of psychology, so that one motive is reinforced and another motive is weakened. This is what psychologists would say of will. Will, therefore, is always motive dependent. There is no will if there are no motives. And a will without motives would then be a contradiction in itself. A free will, in a strict sense, as the philosopher Pound and I said, would appear unmotivated and would be indistinguishable from chance. If I ask you why you are here, you said, I don't know. And even if I'm a psychotherapist and after 1 year of investigation I would find no motive, then I would say it was chance. But philosophers would never say it was your free will, because they hate chance. Free will must be a conscious act. And you should say, I was here because I had a conscious act of free will. And then say, let's test this in a functional magnetic resonance imaging apparatus. Okay. So Kant would say this is not an argument, interesting argument of will, because for him the free will was a postulate, as I said, and there can be no empirical evidence of a free will. However, the modern dilemma in criminal law is you have to make it evident. For example, if I'm accused to have killed my boss, they have to make it evident. And strangely enough, they just say, I have a free will, but there is no evidence. So this is a point where most experts of criminal law today now would say, even if there is no evidence for the existence of free will, we should believe in it. This is a necessity. This is a present discussion in criminal law, which is very interesting, because they know you cannot give evidence of the existence of free will. I will stop with this argument because it's very difficult and go back to neurobiology. Now, problems of pan-determinism. Is it true that from the beginning of the universe on, everything was already determined, as a hardcore determinist would say? First, as many physicians say, at least in the microphysical world, objectively random events appear to exist. And I will show you, at least in the brain, there are some apparently random events. And it is not impossible that these random events could build up to large fluctuations and make macroscopic processes partially indeterministic. This is an unsolved problem in physics, and especially in the brain, as I will come back to in a minute. However, even if we assume that we, or the universe, or our brain, are deterministic, we cannot prove it, because in no complex system we can decide whether they are truly deterministic or at least partially indeterministic. Because what we recognize is that complex systems are not fully predictable. And this is independent of whether they are fully deterministic but complex, or they have partially indeterministic. A friend of mine, Uwe Anderheiden, many years ago has proved a fundamental proof in mathematics that in complex systems that behave unpredictably, you cannot decide whether they are truly deterministic or indeterministic. So whatever the brain may be, it is so complex that with no tool you can decide it is deterministic or indeterministic. This is one deep problem, and this is particularly true for the universe. Even if I would believe that the universe were absolutely deterministic, I could never prove it. There are paradoxes. And one nice paradox is Planck's prediction paradox, because full determinism would function only with me if I didn't know what I'm going to do tonight. So if I'm ignorant of this, because if you tell me tonight you will drink 2 glasses of red wine, I will say, oh, thank you, so I decide I will drink 1 glass of white wine. So I can act contrary to the prediction, which is absolutely possible. Only if it is unknown, your prediction is unknown, you could test whether or not I will truly drink 2 glasses of wine. So you can show that full determinism leads to paradoxes, and one is the one I told you is one of these paradoxes. Is the brain a deterministic system? The brain is very complex. It has about 100 billion neurons, and it has trillions and trillions of synapses, and every synapse at least can assume 10 different functional states. So the possibility of different states, even inside the cortex of the brain, they show you, is 10 to the 150. And the number of elementary particles in the universe is 10 to the 80. So the brain is really complex. This means nobody could calculate the activity and the outcome of the activity of the brain. Nobody. But beside this problem, let's ask, are there random events inside the brain? And the answer is yes. There are several sites, for example, the membranes of synapses and neurons have so-called channels, and they open and close randomly. Also, the so-called release of vesicles with transmitters. One vesicle, the release of one vesicle is a random event, cannot be predicted. And this is something intermediate between microscopic and macroscopic level. Let's say it's microscopic, although they're molecules, but they're random. And the discussion is now, does this random events, do these random events have any relevance for the activity of our brain? And most experts would say no. Because in order for a synapse to be active or to be inhibited, we need millions of such events. There's one synapse out of trillions and trillions of synapses. And you can calculate for simple arm movement, I need 1 billion of synapses. So it's extremely probable that all random synaptic events and even membrane channel events are averaged out, have been calculated, and it's 6 orders of magnitude. Our activity, brain activity, relevant to our behavior, is 6 orders of magnitude higher than this level of random events. So probably, although at the very basis of the brain there are random events, they're completely averaged out. And you can see this, although many neurons inside the brain fire, which means create action potential in a very sloppy way. In our inner ear, for example, these neurons, in the acoustic neurons, can fire at levels of microseconds. Absolutely precise. So whenever the brain wants to be precise, then it is precise at the level of microseconds. So when something is sloppy in the brain, this is not random. This is for other reasons. So let's leave this difficult topic. There are truly, it appears, there are truly events inside the brain, but most probably they play no role at that macroscopic level that is decisive for the guidance of our movement. Because this is, one movement requires millions and millions of neurons and trillions of synapses, and whatever one synapse or one vesicle of one synapse is doing is irrelevant. This is similar in elections. What one vote is doing in Bremen among 50 million voters is irrelevant. It's statistics. Let us have a quick look into the brain and ask how the brain prepares and controls willed actions. And now comes the question, can we discover the metaphysical gap? Is there a gap? Or could we fully explain the entire sequence from the will of moving my arm, the will, to the final action? Is there a gap? And this gap must be substantial. This is my argument, because all acts, whether free-willed or not, require the action of millions of neurons. And we should be able to see it. Okay, this is the human brain. You may know it in the meantime, and let's see what is involved in the guidance of voluntary actions. In those actions which I explain, I wanted them. Even though I move my arms, my hands, automatically, if you ask me, who is doing this? It's me. So again, there need be no explicit act of will. Nevertheless, voluntary actions are those actions, not those that are explicitly willed, but those that are ascribed to me. These are voluntary actions. Even the automatic action. This is very important. It was me. If I have a reflex behavior, then I say it wasn't me, it was my hand. And in court, this is very important. If I have an epileptic seizure and I cause a car incident, I'm not guilty. Recent case. If, however, did something which in principle can be voluntarily controlled, I may be guilty. Even in criminal law, this is extremely important because they can ascribe it to me. So this is the outer surface, and for free will or voluntary action, there is a orbital frontal cortex, which is the seat of conscious goals and wishes and emotions. They are regions of unconscious motions and goals. So this is a ventral frontal brain, frontal cortex. Then there is a dorsal frontal cortex. You will see this later in more detail. This is the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, who is setting the goal, rational goal. Then we have some parts that guide our eye movements. Then the premotor zone that prepares a gross tract of movements, goal-directed movements. And then there is a motor cortex which breaks down all this more global goals into fine movements, finger movements, lip movements, tongue movements. So the primary motor cortex is doing the exact details of movements, and the premotor cortex is doing more the gross trajectories. The orbital frontal cortex is doing setting the goals, the motive goals, and the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex is saying, oh, if you want to do this, then you have to start in this sequence. I will repeat this in a second. Then, looking from the inside of the brain, there are, again, so over the hill, you see, if you look over the hill inside, then we see the motor cortex, and as a premotor cortex, supplementary motor area, which is doing nothing more than the premotor cortex. Here there is a tiny but very interesting zone, the pre-supplementary motor area. And this pre-supplementary motor area fires only when I want to do something, when I have the explicit will of doing something. And my famous colleague, Sir John Eccles, who also was not only Catholic, but also defender of free will, he believed that this pre-SMA was the seat of free will inside the brain, the liaison brain. And if this region doesn't fire, this means I will not attribute my actions to myself. So it has to do something with free will. However, I just tell you, if you take a stimulating electrode and put it here into this pre-SMA region and stimulate it, what will happen? The patient will do something, and if I ask him, why did you do this? And he will say, because I wanted it. So this is a region that mediates the feeling, I wanted this, but if you stimulate electrically, then these feelings come on and I claim I wanted it. And why this is the case, I will explain you in a minute. So this again is this list for all those who want to have more details, the orbital frontal cingulate cortex. These are the conscious wishes, the motivation, the awareness of consequences of own action and so on, the prefrontal cortex, goal awareness, conscious action planning, and so on. And finally, the primary motor cortex is the steering of fine musculature. So the entire sequence, are extremely complicated sequence, very well known, explaining in which way a goal or tendency now to grasp something, The pure idea, pure wish is transformed into action. We have this is a very old brain imaging picture 40 years ago, but again, this was fantastic when they made the first imaging pictures. Simple finger movement, this is a primary motor cortex. Of course, if you move the finger, then the brain, you see the primary motor cortex is being activated. If the finger movement are complex in piano playing, for example, then the premotor cortex in the supplementary motor area is activated because complex things and will things are needed. And if you imagine finger movement and have the will of moving the finger but not yet done, then this pre-SMA is active. So this was sensational when we discovered the pure idea, I'm going to do something, I want it, leads to action inside the brain. Now, upon these three areas, the motor area, premotor area, and pre-SMA, arises the famous readiness potential. There's a slow negativity which can be identified using EEG and has to be averaged out, but which means before we are doing something, we have the tendency here about 1 second before something is being done. There's slow negativity, which means motor neurons inside the cortex start synchronizing themselves. This takes 1 second, sometimes even more. And they have to synchronize them until they're fully synchronized. There's a steep increase and there's a maximum, and then we are doing something. This is important for the so-called readiness potential. Otherwise, single neurons cannot pass a certain level. Only after synchronization, the 1,000 or 10,000 motor neurons say, we want all the same. Now we want to move the finger, and now let's do it. This is the readiness potential. We will play an important role. So everything appears to be clear. There are some wishes, and they come into the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. There's action planning. Oh, I want to move my finger. This is sent to the premotor cortex, and the premotor cortex together with the parietal cortex, not shown, plans the trajectory and then tells the motor cortex, now do it. And then the motor command, it goes back the pyramidal tract and we do it. This is how, even for a dualist, a free will could be turned into a free-willed movement. Wonderful. Even Sir John Eccles would love it. And there is a readiness potential here, and once it has passed a certain level, then we would do it. Unfortunately, this traditional view of control of free voluntary actions is only half of the truth, because this doesn't function. If this were the truth, then many people suffering from Parkinson's disease would not have this disease. They, as you may know, sit in a seat. They want to get up, and they are unable to get up. They want it. They strongly have the wish to get up. They cannot. And their deficit is not here, is not inside the cortex. Although it is the cortex that gives the command via the pyramidal tract to the motor segment in the spinal cord, and then I will move my finger. What had been overlooked? The deficit is in the basal ganglia, is not in the cortex. And the basal ganglia, huge parts of the telencephalon, are absolutely necessary. You see here, nucleus caudatus, putamen, and globus pallidus, huge centers inside the brain. Here we have the cortex. They are absolutely necessary for the initiation of free-willed actions, although they are working unconsciously. So something deeply unconscious decides whether or not a willed action will be executed, which is shocking. And let's see why this is the case. The function of the basal ganglia is that they are an action memory, because they are a memory for all those things that had in our past life have been done successfully. This may be automatic, and this may be even new things that have to be carried out in a novel way. Everything that is stereotyped, everything we are doing, shifting gears in our car, or riding a bicycle, or even moving the lips so that the words come out as I want it. Everything we need, no conscious control, all these sequences of actions are inside the basal ganglia. But strangely enough, when people want something new, this cannot be done even without this basal ganglia, in a way which I'm going to explain. So, and now we have learned an important lesson. The cortex is one important seat of voluntary action. And we are mostly conscious of those actions. But there is a big center in our brain that is completely unconscious, and if it doesn't agree, now let's do this action, the action cannot be executed, see the Parkinson's disease patients, because they have a tiny deficit in the basal ganglia, as I will show you, the lack of dopamine signal. And as soon as I give them a certain substance, L-DOPA, they will be able to follow their free will. Let's first, okay. Then, before I come to the answer to the problem, let's ask who or what controls the basal ganglia. So we have learned that the basal ganglia have to say yes to what the cortex wants. I have a conscious goal or will, but if the basal ganglia in a complicated way don't say yes, you are allowed to do it, I will be unable to do it. Now the more difficult question is, who tells the basal ganglia what to do? Inside the brain there is no center that commands without being commanded. Every center is a commander and is commanded. So the cortex is a commander, but is commanded by the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, who commands the basal ganglia? The limbic system. Limbic system is this part of the brain, I think I was talking about them, that regulates emotions and stores emotion, is emotional memory. And to make a long story short, there's the amygdala, Center for Innate Emotions and Emotional Conditioning, mostly saying what is bad and what we should avoid. Not strictly, but mostly what is surprising, what is bad for us. The amygdala says, you should not do this. But she said it, the amygdala, in a completely unconscious way. We have then the feeling of fear and anxiety. And the opposite is doing the mesolimbic system. This should go there, but not there, just wrong place, the ventral tegmental area. In the other part, they are the reward and reward expectation system. They tell us what to approach, because it's good, or at least it proposes you, it promises you a reward. So the amygdala says what we should not do because of bad experience, and the mesolimbic system tells you what we should do because it was good in the past. So there are two subsystems, those that rewarded us, these are the famous endogenous opioids, and there's the reward expectation system, which is linked to dopamine. Dopamine always tells the brain what the brain should do in a motivational state and in a motor state, which is very important. And now we have here this scheme. This is the brain, these are the basal ganglia, this is the limbic system. So limbic system, basal ganglia are inside the brain. Of course, I have just put them out for didactic reasons. If we want something which we know, which is automatic and stereotyped, the posterior parietal cortex, which is also responsible for automatic stereotyped actions, for example, walking or moving my hand or giving a lecture which I've given 100 times. It says, let's do something. But in this case, it has to send this wish to the basal ganglia, and they sort the memory for actions, and they say, if you want to do this, you should do it in this case, and I will provide you with the sequence. This is an automatic sequence at 99.5% of our daily life. Then it goes back, and within a fraction of a second, a few seconds, we are doing this. However, if we have the wish doing something new, or have now the wish to drinking a cup of coffee, then this wish comes from my unconscious brain to the conscious part, and then this wish first has to be sent to the basal ganglia. And since it is new, the basal ganglia, I say it in a non-philosophical way, ask the limbic system, is this a good idea now to go out to drink a cup of coffee? Then my mesolimbic system would say, oh, this is a good idea, coffee is wonderful, but the amygdala would say, oh, this is not a good system. People would be shocked that I'm leaving the classroom for drinking coffee. So then it's being decided, and they remember the past. Did it have good consequences or bad consequences if you did similar things in your past? And the amygdala would say it had bad consequences, not only. And the mesolimbic system would say, oh, it was rather good. So they fight with each other, which is important, and then they send a signal to the prefrontal cortex, this is not a good idea. And then the prefrontal cortex may ask the basal ganglia and the limbic system again. So for novel wishes and goals, this may go on for minutes or even for hours and months. Should I go to Greece for vacation? Should I prepare myself now for the exam within 2 years and so on? Should I accept the offer from Munich or remain in Bremen? May go on for a year for German. And then the brain does not act immediately, which would be dangerous, but asks the conscious and especially the unconscious or intuitive brain whether this is a good or bad idea. It asks all our conscious and unconscious experience, which resides mostly in the basal ganglia and the limbic system. And this comes up then in either the enforcement of the idea, to have a coffee now, or in the suppression, because I learned this is not a good idea. People would be offended if I did this. The past, my experience. And finally, I'm doing something, I'm not doing something. But after I have done similar things, this reflection phase diminishes and things become automatized. And finally, I have just an automatic idea what I should do, and the most of the job is done by the basal ganglia. This is a process from novel actions to automatic actions inside the brain. At the very beginning, when something is new, there's a complex evaluation process between conscious and unconscious part of the brain. This may go on for a long time if it's complicated, or in short time if it's not complicated. So, voluntary actions in view of present-day neuroscience are planned, prepared, executed, and evaluated. These are the 4 steps. We plan something, then our brain prepares something, the premotor cortex, then we are doing something, and then the most important step is to evaluate whether or not things have been carried out as planned and whether they had good or bad consequences. This is then stored in the limbic system. And this is done, as I told you, by the interaction of conscious cortical and unconscious limbic centers, including the basal ganglia. So even the most willed actions are always the result of the interaction between conscious things and unconscious things. Because our unconscious brain includes the basal ganglia and the limbic system, and there all our past experience, including our intuitions, are stored. Whereas the cortex has no such experience. This is a deep sense why, when we're doing something new, our unconscious or intuitive experience brain is being asked. And there are unconscious part and conscious part, and this means that only part of voluntary actions are guided by conscious activity. Most parts of the voluntary actions are decided unconsciously. And if we're going to repeat those things, consciousness and the free will action become minimal until we do it without any hesitation, without any reflection. So, how could we prove this? I told you that this is the entire sequence as we know today, and up to now there is no big gap. So people can, by any kind of method, can trace the unconscious wish pathway to become conscious, and then the preparation, premotor, and then motor, and the basal ganglia, and this is known in neurology since 50 years. But is this everything? No. There was a famous colleague, Benjamin Libet, who died a few years ago, and I came to know him personally, and he was a Catholic, and he believed in free will. And he was a genius in neurobiology, and he said, let's find out a method how to demonstrate the existence of free will. And since he was an Orthodox Catholic, he of course assumed there is an immaterial act of free will. And this immaterial act of free will moves the brain, influences the brain, and let's go back, and starts these circles which were known to him, at least partially. So that the immaterial free will and the immaterial free will interacts with the prefrontal cortex in the pre-supplementary motor area, and this was what Sir John Eccles believed. All those Catholic neurobiologists who believed in free will, they on the one hand understood free will actions are impossible without the brain. On the other hand, I'm dualist, I'm believing in something which is not the brain, so some immaterial agency must be outside the brain but influencing the brain. So the immaterial free will tells the brain, now move my finger. This is not trivial because as a naive philosopher I could ask, why doesn't the free will move my finger directly? Why does the free will need the brain? This is an answer which those people could not give. But it's a good question. Okay, but they believed the free will needs a brain. But now, there is a readiness potential. As I told you, it is 1 to 2 seconds before I'm doing something. This is this negativity. And if I can measure this negativity, this readiness potential, on the scalp of my head, I can decide whether the free will precedes the start of the readiness potential, as I hope, or comes later, which would be bad. So the redness potential starts, let's say, 1 second, or is clear 1 second before I'm doing something. So let's hope that the free will is before and not comes after. Would be very bad. Now the question was, how could we determine the moment when I have the free will decision? And he had the idea that there was a fast rotating arm here on this clock, and people were watching a clock, and during 10 seconds, 15 seconds, they suddenly decided, let's move my hand or press this button. So they were sitting there, and they had time, let's say 1 minute, and within the period of 1 minute, they had to decide absolutely upon their free will when to press a button. And when they sense the urge now to do it, they had to watch the clock here and to say it was 10 or 1 or so when I pressed the button. This needs some training, but this is possible. It's not too difficult. So, by controlling the moment of the decision of free will and the initiation of the redness potential, he could decide whether the act of free will precedes and releases the redness potential or comes after the initiation of free will. Good question. What did he find out? Of course, he was very embarrassed. This is the beginning of the redness potential 1 second before, or half a second before if the movement is unplanned, and there was a conscious act of will 200 to 300 milliseconds before something was done. In thousands and thousands of runs. He was absolutely shocked. This meant, in this paradigm of voluntarily pressing this button, the conscious act of will came long after the beginning of the redness potential. The brain already, as he then wrote, has already decided what to do before my consciousness knows how I will decide. He was desperate. In '83, and then it was published, and he was desperate, and philosopher and everybody was shocked. And the interpretation was, the brain, involuntary action, has already decided unconsciously before we decide consciously. So there is no free will. Then people came and said in the next 20 years, oh, this is only true for automatic actions. In true decisions, this will be completely otherwise. Also, this is average. You have to have thousands of runs, although in no run, as far as I remember, did Libet find that the free will preceded the beginning of the run. Anyway, there were lots of methodological questions, especially that the so-called symmetric redness potentials does not really determine the action. It's only the lateralized redness potential, which means when I want to move my right hand, the left redness potential on the left side, it's crossed, has to fire, and when I'm going to move my left arm, it has to be right. It's lateralized. So first, the redness potential is bilateral, then it switches to the opposite side of the movement because it's crossed. The pyramidal tract is crossed. So people said, well, let's concentrate on the lateralized. So we have not 1,000 or 2,000 milliseconds or 2 milliseconds. We have just 600 milliseconds. Let's see. Let's repeat the experiment. This was done by my friends Haggard and Eimer in 1999, and they found exactly the same. You see, moment of free will decisions, 350 milliseconds before action, and start of the lateralized redness potential 800, 700, 900, 700. Regardless of what the type of selection was, Libet was fully confirmed even when making the experiments more carefully. But again, this was pressing buttons and automatic and so on. People said, well, it's not really convincing. Until one of my students, John Haynes, now a famous professor at Humboldt, and his colleagues made another experiment now with functional brain imaging. And he slightly changed the experiments, and he did not present a clock, rotating clock, but he presented, or they presented, a fast sequence of letters. And you had, again, to choose whether to press at any voluntary moment the right or left finger. And when you were doing this, you had to remember the letter when you decided, which avoided any inference with the motor cortex and other artifacts. To make a long story short, what they could show with brain imaging is that the pre-SMA and the motor cortex and the left motor cortex, the right motor cortex, they fired when people said, now I want it. Exactly at this moment. This is the line when there was the vertical red line, if you can identify it, of the decision, and then comes the activity of the motor parts of the cortex. Now you should know that in brain imaging, the signal, brain imaging needs 4 to 6 seconds in order to get up. So you have to subtract this delay, and it would be absolutely identical. So whenever the pre-SMA and the premotor and motor cortex fire, this then, as I showed, is exactly the moment when you have the will or decision to do something. But in the parietal cortex, which has to do, as I said, with automatic movements, but also in the frontopolar cortex, in the frontal cortex, they fired 4 to 8 seconds before the motor cortex and the free will action arose. And if you now subtract the 4 seconds, you come up to 10 seconds. So what they found, Haynes and his colleagues found, before this red line, people become aware whether to press the left or right button. Their frontal cortex, the frontopolar cortex, part of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, has already decided 10 seconds before what to do. And now there is no question that plus minus 100 milliseconds, you can just be, can fail remembering well, but not for 10 seconds. 10 seconds is a long sequence. So there is now absolutely no doubt that whatever we are going to do, there is an unconscious preparation of what we're doing. Then this comes up to our mind in the prefrontal cortex. Then it remains unconscious. And after 4 to 6 to 8 seconds, it becomes a conscious will, because it has to synchronize itself. And then it is sent to the premotor motor cortex, and then we do it, and we do something which we wanted before. So there's absolutely no doubt that Libet was right. But even in now, during the last years, in more complex decisions, that every complex conscious decision is prepared by unconscious activity of the limbic system. This goes then to the cortex. We become aware of this need, of the goals, and then it's being evaluated by the cortex in the basal ganglia. This takes 1 second, or may take 1 year. If you, Professor Kappas, get an offer from another university, and for 1 year you are ventilating cortex and basal ganglia what to do and not to do. This depends on the motives. If the motives are right, you do it. If the motives are ambiguous, take 1 year. So, this is the story I can tell you as a neuroscientist or a psychologist. And I can tell you the reason behind, because this hyper-complex sequence of activity guarantees that whatever we are doing, it goes to the conscious and the unconscious filter of our past experience. In our past experience, the limbic system, there are all our motives. And even the past experience of our motives, and the most rational behavior is to act according to our past experience, which is, of course, mostly a social experience. All society, all social experience is inside our individual experience because we are social beings. So the most reasonable way to decide is to listen to our experience. And unfortunately, most of our experience is not explicitly conscious. It is intuitive or it is completely unconscious. But the brain is doing the most rational thing in decisions. Listen to your experience. This is the reason why free will would not function. Free will would be the possibility to act against your experience, which will be silly. Okay, we can discuss this. But how would an acceptable concept of free will look like? This does not mean that free will does not exist. It means only the free will in this metaphysical concept of Kant does not exist. That a pure metaphysical entity decides and tells the brain what to do. This is nonsense. There's no evidence. And even Kant, as I told you, knew that there would be no evidence, no psychological evidence. And as psychologists would agree, it's good that we have our experience and use it for our decisions. One solution is motive determinism. This is opposite to this pan-determinism. We need not believe that everything was already decided from the very beginning of the universe, which is silly. First, we can never prove it. And second, we do not know the role, possibly big role, of chance, of random events, maybe gigantic. The only thing we believe in, and psychologists believe in, whatever we do in one moment is, besides pure chance, we don't know whether it plays a role in our brain, is determined by conscious and unconscious motives. And the motives result from our experience, from our genes, from our subjective experience, from society, and from the actual situation. And we need not speculate where we forced to do this or that. Just look at this moment, because you decided perhaps to go to the cinema tonight. But just before you go out, you listen to a person and he proposes you, let's go to another talk, or let's go for a walk or something. So even 1 second before, not 300 milliseconds, 1 second before, something can happen and you decide completely in another way. So a criminal decided to kill his boss, almost starts killing him, and then there's the police coming. He hears the sirens of the police and he stops it and runs away. So until the very last moment, we are not fully determined. It makes no sense to say that we are fully determined, because in the very last moment, the minimum is 300 milliseconds before we are doing something, because then the redness potential lateralized has decided, and we cannot stop. But before we reach 300 milliseconds, something can happen, and our complete causation is different. So on the one hand, we can never prove that pan-determinism is correct because things can happen until the last second. On the other hand, when it happens, people, psychologists and I, could eventually explain all this causally, because in the very last moment, a strong motive could come up, oh, what I'm doing. And this may be random or not, we don't know, and we're doing something different. But when we are doing something, it's determined. This is what we find. Yeah, of course.
Is there a material representation of motives?
Of course, of course.
Where?
Yeah, even, for example, if you are going to murder the president of Jacobs University for one or the other reason, and you are fully decided, and in the very last second before you are going to kill him, something come up to your mind, oh, what I'm doing here. And this is sudden to you, but a neuroscientist could have looked into your brain, and 5 seconds before your amygdala has fired and told your conscious not to do it. So even this switch in decisions has its antecedents, its history. Nothing happens at random. So even the sudden switch in motives has its root in the limbic system. This is necessary, and you can prove this. Even if in the very last second somebody says, oh, I'm not going to do it, it has the root inside the switch. For example, amygdala finally comes up with fear or anxiety. So this was an important question. Now finally, let's take the present example here. We are sitting in this lecture hall, and there was no external or internal force, I hope so, that urged us to be here. No revolver in front of you, or no psychic force that forced you to come here, unknown disease, psychic disease forced to come here tonight. So whenever I ask you, why did you come here? You say, because I wanted it. And this expression means there was no external force and there was no internal force, because there's internal force, for example, to wash your hand every 5 minutes. This is terrible. And you know that this is an internal force, or you are driven by anxiety or fear. Say, I want to compete against my fear, but I cannot. So this is internal force. And I could force you to come here. Unfortunately, I didn't. So to say I'm here because I wanted it means there was no external or internal force. And it's very clear whether there is such a force or not for ordinary people. Secondly, there was a realistic choice. If I have no choice, I do not feel free will. But there was a choice. You could remain home, could go to a cinema, to go to some other lecture, but you came here. This is the will. The will needs alternatives. If I'm doing something without any decisions, I ascribe it to me, but I need no will. The will is when competing motives are there. You could have stayed home, you're here, and you talk about your will. And of course, this decision to be here, the act of will, was based on unconscious, pre-conscious, and conscious motives and or conscious reflection. If I ask you why you were here, you say, oh, because I wanted it. Let's ask you, what does this mean? Please give me the entire list why you're here. Because I wanted to know something about free will. Because I had nothing else to do. Because I wanted to meet my friend. I long ought to see a nice professor. Long list, and they said this is not sufficient. Then I take a psychotherapist and he will analyze you for a year. And the list gets longer and longer and longer. And finally you say, but this doesn't interest me. It was my will. I wanted it. And of course, there were many motives, conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious motives. Okay. The important thing is there was a will and you could do what you wanted. If there had been other motives in reflection, we would have decided otherwise, but we haven't. And the famous philosopher David Hume says, people have a free will, or at least feel free when they can do what they want. But they're not really interested in the question, what constitutes my will? Because it's my will. Of course, I would say, my will is the result of incredibly many motives, past and present, conscious, unconscious, pre-conscious. And this is the solution. The only condition is that there's no external or internal force, and there are alternatives. If there were no alternatives, you had to go there, of course this would be an internal or external force. So, we are free if we are not exposed to external internal coercion. If we are confronted with realistic alternative, realistic means physically and psychologically realistic. You can realistically imagine to do something different, but you decided to come here and the decisions are guided by your motives. If we do what we want consciously and unconsciously, this is the highest form of free will if our unconscious motives and our conscious motives are in harmony. And if we study patients or people who do not feel really free, then I can predict there's some disharmony between their conscious will and their unconscious will, and this is very bad. And some decisions give you the feeling of not having well decided, and this can be shown that there is a disharmony between your unconscious motives and your conscious motives. And the best is if you do something consciously what your unconscious limbic system wanted, then you are absolutely free. And this motivational network, there may be a fight or just any ruling out of different motives. Your will is then the result, the trajectory coming from this network inside the brain. There's many, many different centers, conscious and unconscious, that fight against each other sometimes, and finally a certain will comes up. So this is a global network inside our brain, conscious, pre-conscious, unconscious, that in any decision has to find out what to do. Immaterial free will would then be indistinguishable from random decisions because we would find no motive. Even after a year of investigation, your decision to come here, I would find no convincing motive, and then I would conclude it was random. But this would be horrible. Our society is based on, this is the irony, if there were free will, society would not exist in the present form. Thank you for your attention.